am beyond excited to have incredible speakers with me. I'll let them introduce themselves. Natalie, let's start with you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Brees, Chief People and Diversity Officer at thredUP. If you're not familiar with thredUP, we are one of the world's largest online consignment shops for women and kids clothing. I've been at thredUP for about 7 years now, from being a private company to today being a public company. And our workforce consists of both distribution center employees, blue collar workers, as well as knowledge workers at headquarters. I'm thrilled to be here.
Amazing. Patty.
Hi, everyone. Patty Egan. I run our people operations and total rewards practice here at GitLab. I'm hoping that most of you have heard of GitLab. We are a DevSecOps platform, really for, it's a platform for developers from start to finish. I have been here about 2.5 years, so not super long, but long enough to really, understand how this whole remote work, really, increases the productivity and really achieves our retention, and our people practices are so much easier. So love to talk about that today.
Amazing. And I'm Lisa. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Gable. So while everyone is still joining, I want to start this with a really fun icebreaker, I would say. Also, people who are listening to us, please write in the chat, what was your first job? I can start. Actually, I mentioned this in a previous webinar where I started as someone basically doing scrappy work at a pizza place and grew through the ranks there. It actually taught me a lot on how to handle people and how to negotiate, funnily enough, and in general customer service. So it was a really good experience. I stayed there for a very long time. And funnily enough, my second job was working at an ice cream shop. Patty, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Well, it looks like I'm similar to everybody in the chat as well. I worked at Burger King as my first job, and I only got that job because my sister was already there, but she was a really good worker and I was not so good. So I think they regretted it after a while, but it was my first job. I learned more about what not to do than what to do.
That's great. Natalie?
I love that, Patty. I think everybody at some point needs to work in some sort of like service job.
Fast food. Yeah.
Not for me.
I love seeing everything in the chat too. So my first like unofficial job was babysitter at 11, 12 years old. But then like official job, I worked as a sales associate at Gap. I think like making $4 and something an hour, folding jeans. Really like learned grit and hard work during that time.
Yeah, there is nothing more than honestly all of these jobs is grit and hard work. So totally relate. Amazing. It's love seeing in the chat such a variety, honestly. Pretty cool. Okay. So a little bit about Gable. For those of you that don't know, Gable is the operating system for the modern workplace. We really aim to provide one-stop shop of a solution for people and workplace team to manage their workplace strategy. We have a marketplace of on-demand co-working spaces of thousands of spaces to provide employees on-demand access to wherever they are, but also helping you manage your own offices as well. We really focus on collaboration and engagement, and you will see this as part of the questions is how do you create culture in a distributed world? And we top it off with analytics and insights on how your workforce is doing and using spaces. Wanted to dive right in. We recently released our workplace strategy spectrum. And I think the common thread here is that there is no one strategy that fits all. And that's the strategy in a sense, that you as company and people leaders need to understand what works for your employees. So there is like a bell curve. We see companies that are fully remote, remote first, hybrid first, hybrid that, would do whatever you want as long as you come to the office occasionally, or manage hybrid. We see this as well. And there are, of course, some companies that are fully in office. So wanted to ask our incredible speakers, where do you place yourselves on the spectrum? Natalie, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I love this slide. I think it's just so great to see like the variety here. thredUP really falls kind of in the middle here. I'll focus on like the corporate team. So we're in office 3 days a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. However, we also adopted a 4-day work week a couple of years ago. So we work Monday through Thursday. I'm sure I'll get a chance to talk more about that as we continue.
Amazing. Patty, how about you?
Wow. We are 100% remote. We don't have a building anywhere in the world, but in about 65 countries with at least one team member in that country, and have always been fully remote from the beginning about 12 years ago.
Amazing. Basically, very much ahead of the curve,
Yeah.
I would say. Great. And I think we would love to discuss later on, how did you choose such different strategies, right? Great. So we'll talk about it in a second. But wanted to start to kick us off with a poll. To our lovely audience, what's your current workplace policy? We'll see if the bell curve is correct. Okay, I think we can close the poll. Okay, so bell curve is very much aligned. Hybrid, very much relevant here. Interesting. So key moments and mostly hybrid that days vary each week, but we do see the prescribed days similar to what Natalie mentioned here. Interesting. Okay, great. Wanted for the audience and for my lovely speakers to see a few stats regarding return to office and in general flexibility in work. I think the stats are just so interesting from several perspectives. One, wanted to point out for the audience the fact that 88% of employees actually think that work-life balance and flexibility go hand in hand, and this is what they cherish as part of the work environment. On the opposite side, actually not on the opposite side, on very much correlated, companies that have mandated some return to office policies have actually experienced attrition. And finally, the 62% of employees that report that they don't really have a say in the company's workplace strategy and policy is a high number. Patty, Natalie, what do you think? Does it relate to what you do at your companies? Natalie, I'll let you start.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I would say the first stat, the 88% of employees focus on work-life balance has actually been like a really kind of pivotal piece of our decision to adopt the 4-day work week. And for us, just to give a bit of history there, back in 2020, we started to talk about this. And what we talked about was, if you think about, like, if we really stop and think about like some of the things that we learned during the pandemic, and the things that we valued during the pandemic, it was the ability to have a little bit more flexibility, cut down on commute time for those that were going into an office beforehand. And like the things like sitting down at the table with your family for dinner, like that we really just were able to get back to and remember how important that was to us. And so when we adopted the 4-day workweek policy, it was really rooted in knowing like those were the things that we valued during the pandemic that we didn't want to lose. And so how do we have it all, and how do we create a company culture that is very focused on, of course, delivering against our business objectives and delivering, all of our goals and against our mission, but at the same time also like recognizing what really matters to our team and giving them more time back to index on the things that really matter to them. And so it was kind of our way of solving the, like, we knew as an organization we wanted to get back into the office to some degree, but what was the compromise there, where we were in the office but we're also indexing heavily on the work-life balance piece.
That's amazing. Patty, anything that stood out to you?
Yeah. So, if I think about our team member population here at GitLab, I think that a lot of them would say that they don't have a choice in the policy, because the policy is part of who we are. We attract people who enjoy the remote work, working, and they enjoy the flexibility. We have people in so many locations throughout the world that, their weekend is not the same as the US. Israel has a different weekend than we do. So just offering the flexibility to choose when and where they work has really been a game changer for our culture. And we hold that very dear, and we make sure that we protect that piece. To Natalie's point, flexibility and having people choose is super important. It's not reducing the results or reducing the output that they're delivering. It's allowing them to do that where they feel most comfortable and when they feel most comfortable. So it creates challenges with collaboration, which we've solved with the handbook, but flexibility, work-life balance, we continue to hear those as positives for our culture, because people feel that they have that with the flexibility that we offer. So it's definitely something that's super important, and I believe our culture supports it. I think it's a blending. To Natalie's point, results still matter, and so we have to always make sure that people feel invested in the end result, and making sure that they know, boy, this month we've got this big project ahead, and it may mean that you have more time spent at work rather than less, but it's not inflexible. It's not taking away the flexibility about where and when to work.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you both talk in terms of what you care for the employees in terms of flexibility and work-life balance and feeling connected. But the workplace policies are very different, right? One company is fully remote, and Natalie, you mentioned that basically you always knew that you're gonna come back to the office in some capacity. So how does, the goals are the same, but the strategies to get there are actually very different. So Natalie, you mentioned you always knew. How did you always knew that, that's something that's you will do, basically, return to office some capacity?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lisa, because I think every organization was kind of rethinking how they wanted to collaborate. And I think, fundamentally at thredUP, we knew we were an organization that really valued the opportunity for in-person collaboration, and also recognizing, I think in fully remote, I think it works in so many ways. And Patty, clearly you've all made it successful, but there is a cognitive tax with that too, the screen time and knowing all of that, and wanting to be able to have a culture that felt very, very connected to us, meant being able to sit across the desk from others. And so we actually walked into it. We didn't start by saying, okay, everybody, we're going in the office 3 days a week. We tested a few different things. We started with going in the office 1 week a month for 3 days. Then we were like, okay, that feels like, because it was only that 1 week, it's almost like if you work out really hard at the gym for 1 week and then you don't do it for 3 weeks, the next time you go to the gym, you're like, I feel like I didn't build any muscle. So so we were like, this isn't really working. So then we switched to 1 day a week to kind of test that and see how it went. So we tried a few different iterations of it before we realized there actually was so much value in being together for those 3 days, but then also knowing that there is also a tax of like of the commute and all of that. So we preserved 1 day at home per week. So you have that opportunity to do that. And then again, the additional day off per week, which just was the right move for our company and knowing the culture that we've built.
Amazing. Okay, we talked a lot about culture. Let's ask the audience. How well is culture defined in your organization? Okay, let's close it. Interesting. So a lot of we're working on it, not well defined, mostly defined, sometimes need clarification. Only 40% said everyone's on the same page. And I think that's part of the challenges. And you both talked about it. That's part of, how to create a workplace strategy, right? So interesting. Okay. I'll stop sharing my screen. I want to continue with a few questions. Great. So actually, a few things. Let's talk about culture. Natalie, I really like what you mentioned before. One is the iterative aspect of what workplace strategy works. But how do you tie it in to the culture? That's one question. What do you think?
Yeah. So this is a really challenging question because of the dynamics of our workforce. So we really have, although we're one company, in some ways, two distinct cultures, because 25% of our workforce are knowledge workers that work either in a corporate location, or we do have some that are fully remote that were hired through the pandemic. But then the other 75-80% are in our distribution centers. And so we have a set of cultural values that we believe are like critical for our business across the board. But then we do have like another set of values that are distinct to the distribution center. And that is because we recognize that the work that's being done is different, and the talent in those two locations are different. And so we want to make sure the values really speak to each workforce independently. And I would say, but one that's like absolutely like transcendent across both is that we're an organization that is very rooted in being output driven and not focused on inputs. And so I think because that is so important to our culture, it makes it so much easier to then adopt other policies like a 4-day work week, or around like 3 days in office, 1 day at home, is that we really we are focused on, a key set of outputs that we are all committed to in terms of performance for the organization. And less focused on like, what the ways in which you get those things done, the time that you need to take. And so we want to give people the flexibility. If you treat people like adults, they act like adults. Like, you give them some flexibility around how they get things done and the matters in which they do. And so that's, to me, like a big part of our culture, and existed like since the 7 years I've been here. And so whenever we've adopted like new, workplace strategy, it's always like we've taken kind of a first principles approach of like, what do we believe to be true? And that is that we want to have a company that's focused more on the outputs than the inputs.
Incredible. And Patty, I think you mentioned basically 12 years. GitLab is fully remote. You have a handbook. Everything is written. I assume that if we have GitLab employees in the audience, they probably said that it's very, very well defined. How basically it came to define these sets of principles? How do you enforce them on a day-to-day? Has anything changed throughout this time?
Well, I'll tell you a little bit about how they came to be, but also, it's not without struggle, right? So I want to kind of talk a little bit about that. So in our handbook, all of our values are there. We use the credit values, which you can read about in our handbook, but it starts with collaboration, and the very next value is results. So we, like Natalie, have been very results driven. We're a engineer founder organization, that's led by the same founder. And so it's really important for us to keep pressing the innovation button and really keep making sure that we're progressing our product. But I would say we do things very differently here. The handbook is not just a repository for content. It's the way we work. It's the way that we iterate on information. So I think the best way to explain this is to give an example. So back when the Ukraine war started, we were really focused on helping our employees in Ukraine. And we as leaders came together and really figure out, boy, what can we do? What should we be doing right now? And how can we help? And a team member who was not in Ukraine really felt that we should have a humanitarian leave policy. And that would allow other team members to come together and help and go to Ukraine or go to wherever they felt the humanitarian need was and help. So instead of coming to me or somebody on my team about instituting a humanitarian leave policy, he updated the handbook. And what that does is it puts the idea in front of the people who own the decision. And when we saw that and we received it, we had a choice. We could either click yes and merge it and it became policy, or we could say, maybe not, this isn't needed, or our PTO policies had limited PTO. And so what we did, we didn't approve it, but what we did is we added, for PTO, you can also use your PTO for humanitarian actions. So it led us to take an action. It may not be what the employee asked for, but it also addressed what they were trying to do. I think the challenge with that is the just quantity. How do you address so many needs, wants, and desires while you're also doing what the strategy work is that you're trying to make sure that you're focused on for the whole company? So I think it's illustrative of how we work. It's an idea generator. It's a collaboration tool, and it's also our single source of truth repository. So everybody's on the same page. And that's super important in an all remote workplace, because you need to make sure that even if I'm not available or my team's not available, people can get the answer they're seeking. So super important, but it's not just a repository. And I think that was my biggest learning when I came on board.
Fascinating.
And I think that, it's phenomenal. I think that it brings up a good point of who is involved in defining your workplace strategy, right? So in GitLab, an employee can do a merge request, basically, and maybe that's it. Like, so if we look at the stats that we've seen before, that, in GitLab, employees have a really strong say in workplace policy. And Natalie, you mentioned that basically you did iterations on what is your return to office, but who are the stakeholders when you decide on a workplace strategy, some new policies? Who do you work with on creating this, getting buy-in? I would say, Natalie, let's start with you.
Sure. Yeah. So generally, like, a lot of the ideation will come from a few different places. Like, I think our executive team, one of the reasons I've stayed here as long as I have is, like, the team is incredibly people centric, and everybody on the executive team leans in heavily when it comes to, like, the culture of the organization and the practices that we build. But a lot of it also, we have a very much an open door policy. Like, I'm constantly asking the team to come to me, and, like, that's every level of the organization, with feedback and ideas, similar to how you do it, Patty, with, like, giving access to the handbook and all of that. It's similar, but, like, they can come to me. I also, like, constantly set up meetings just with folks in every level of the organization to do check-ins. But whenever we like an idea, I'll have an idea, or my team will have an idea, and we'll put something together. I'll start to socialize it with the executive team. And then once we feel like we have some conviction over the direction we want to go, we then really leverage our next level of leadership, which is our VP group, and ask for them to give like really honest feedback on how they believe their teams would respond, and what are the things we're not thinking about that they believe their teams would think about. And then we ask them to then socialize those ideas with their direct leaders. So there's a high level of like collaboration through the organization. And then we'll one of the things we do frequently is we'll adopt something, but we're pretty adamant in saying like, we're trying this and we will always evolve based on the needs of our team, but also like the macroeconomic changes and what's going on around us. And so everybody knows we tend to experiment a lot and test things so that the team knows that like we're not saying this is the new way we work and we're not open to any ideas. It's like, this is we're gonna try this, and we're gonna rely on you to give us feedback along the way so we can make tweaks to ensure it's really the best practice for our company.
It's very, very, one, I like that it's upfront, but it's iterative, which always gives room for improvement. And Patty, I wonder from your perspective, who are your, the people that you work closely the most in terms of workplace policies or changes to the handbook? Is it mostly the employees themselves?
Yes. So we have a tagline, and it's part of our why we exist. It's everyone can contribute. So there is a blend between receiving feedback from team members, and they're not shy in sharing feedback, and also sharing ideas from either other companies or local benchmarks. So super helpful to get their input. Just to Natalie's point, I think it's super helpful to get the perspective of the people that you're impacting with the policy. And to be honest with team members when there's really not a choice, it's regulatorily mandated, or something that we're putting out there is not something that GitLab is doing. It's because it's now something that is regulatorily mandated. So just being really clear on why we're doing things and what the decisions have been. I think that there is a lot of input. People are very used to adding context, adding their opinions, adding their experiences from past companies or their perspectives. And we're not always able to, do what everybody wants. Everybody has a different perspective, but actually explaining the decision-making process and why we chose what we chose, it has been, that's what they're looking for. Is just, did you hear that, here at GitLab, we have a saying that you don't have to be seen, but you must be heard. It's like when people talk, we want to make sure, or type or submit, we want to make sure that their idea is at least considered. It slows us down, and that's okay. I had to get used to it 2.5 years ago. Wait, I can't just move this policy in place. I need to get input. But I found time and time again that by getting that input, the end result is always better. So it's taught us to slow down, to go fast.
I love what you said about like the context. That's like such an important part of it too, is like you can't, certain things we just have to do.
Yeah.
But like setting the context makes it so much easier for the team to understand the whys and ultimately be supportive of anything that like regulatorily we have to do.
Yeah, because part of it is, you want to be as inclusive as possible, but at the end of the day, you need to make a decision. So one of my questions was, what do you do when you get pushbacks, right? Let's say even, Patty, now I hear that basically you need to get those inputs. Is there almost a negotiation, or at the end of the day, who makes the choice? Like,
I can certainly go first. We have a value or a a way of working where we have a directly responsible individual, a DRI for all decisions. And
Okay.
it's not okay to make decisions in a vacuum, but it's always, you know, we have a saying that once you say your input, once the DRI has made a decision, you may disagree, but you need to align. I had a situation where a team member was very adamant that we needed to change our COVID vaccine policy or COVID testing policy. Very, very adamant. And he would call me once a month to find out whether we were making changes. And so every month we would talk through it and talk through the different changes, and every month I would go to the leadership and say, is it time? Is it time? Do we need to make changes here? Here's the background, and here's why this employee is feeling this way. But until we got input from the rest of the organization, I wasn't able to yet. Once I got the input from the rest of the organization, I said, you know, when you look across the organization, you are one input that we have to consider. And then there's all of these other people who don't want us to change. So I have to balance all of that and figure out what is most highest priority, and safety is highest priority. And it's okay if we take a few liberties with flexibility, because I want safety is number one. So it's just the context building and understanding that in the end, that employee said, I felt heard. I didn't get my way, but I felt heard, and I appreciate you hearing me. So I think that's half the battle.
And Natalie, question to you. Like, you have iterated throughout the, you know, the workplace policy, basically, as opposed to GitLab, that's it. 12 years were fully remote. Is there still some pushback on the workplace strategy at this point? How do you deal with this tension, I would say, and where does it come from?
Yes, we definitely do we have differing opinions on this. I think there are employees who would prefer for us to be fully remote. And so I think I agree with what you said, Patty, is that we have to be willing to listen. So we take that information in, but then ultimately the decision, our goal is to make decisions that are going to work for the majority. So you're never going to get it right for 100% of the team. It's just, I think if that's our goal, like, we're going to fail most of the time. It's about how do you create the policies that are going to work for the majority, and that also you feel like you can stand behind a year from now, or like 2 years from now. And so, and then I'm also balancing, like, what do we do that doesn't feel like it's not equitable between our corporate team and our distribution center team too. So, you know, one of the things I would say when team members would say, hey, like, I really think I want to work 100% from home, I want to work remotely. One of the things we would say is, look, we totally understand that. We do think, though, as an organization, there's real value in us being together. And 80% of our team is together in a distribution center, you know, 5 days a week. You know, they're open 24 hours a day. And we really think, like, there's that, you know, it's different work, but that is a big part of our team. They commuted into the distribution centers. They were essential workers the entire time through the pandemic. And so we do want to create some equity there. But Patty, I totally, I can empathize with the challenges there. We also have a team in Ukraine. And so it was like a lot of those things, and wanting to do the right thing that you could stand behind today and, you know, down the road.
Yeah.
And how do you measure, you know, the impact of the things that you are doing for employees, for this, you know, strategy, for changes? How do you know that what you're doing is actually working, right? Would love to understand, like, do you survey or do you do focus groups? I think those are top of mind issues with every people leader right now, is how to know that what I'm doing is actually working. Patty, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So of course we do an engagement survey global, overall it's a pretty deep survey, and then we have a pulse survey at the middle of the year. But more importantly, what I like to say is, you raise your hand, you raise your time. So for me, if somebody is proposing a policy change, or we know that certain population of team members are going to be impacted by a change, the first thing I will do is find the people who I think are going to resist it. And we hold a focus group, and we really sit there and talk about options. But it's not just the focus group, it's also using our tool in a merge request. So we put the idea out there. So we think we know who's going to be most invested in this policy change or the iteration of what we're trying to do. But you might find that somebody that you didn't even think of also had an opinion. So by putting it out there for the whole company, allows people to opine and to add context. But I really enjoy meeting with the team members who are mostly impacted and asking them, if you were in my shoes, how would you navigate this with these kind of headwinds that you also need to consider? And so we've gotten some amazing ideas that way. And also opening our I have a lot of background with other companies, but what I've learned here is, just because we've done it one way in other companies doesn't mean we need to continue doing it that way. And coming up with new ideas from people who don't have a people organization background has been instrumental to our innovation. And so I enjoy that. That's exciting for me as a leader, but it's also goes back to everybody can contribute, and the listening ear, which is super important to us. The bigger we get, we're over 21 employees, that's become more and more challenging. So what we're trying to do now is figure out how we can filter through some of the input, because we get a lot, and making sure that we're addressing the most important, because this needs to scale too, and it needs to be able to be something that we can continue, but in a way that doesn't take us away from the most important work, delivering programs for the majority of the team members.
Natalie, what do you think?
I agree. I think we do all of the same things. We do focus groups, we do an engagement survey, we do pulse surveys. And so we're constantly like leveraging that information from the team. I think the other thing, just like in terms of metrics that I really like use as kind of a guiding light, is what is the retention of our team? Are we starting to see, any sort of erosion to retention? Are we able to attract the best and the brightest talent? What do candidates tell us on their way in? What do departing employees tell us on the way out? Like, all of those are really important, like, checkpoints to understand, are we doing the right things? And what are the things that matter most for our internal workforce and the workforce around us? And I think we also are focused on not just retention, but also just like overall engagement. I think most organizations are dealing with a really tough kind of macroeconomic climate right now. And like, are your teams engaged? Are you getting reports of burnout? Like, how are you managing some of those things? And how do you solve for it? So I think as many different kind of avenues to gather feedback as possible is important, because engagement surveys are like, one part of the story, but like not the whole story. So you have to have those additional supplemental check-ins.
I want to wrap up with two Q&A questions from the audience, one for Natalie, one for Patty. I'll start with Natalie. Courtney is asking, Natalie, have you seen any challenges with having two different cultures, right? One is, distributed versus people that are blue collar workers, right? They need to be in the warehouses. How do you, see is there fairness or equality conversation about what is appropriate for remote worker versus someone that must be present?
Yeah,
and
it
how
is.
does, impact the experience of it?
I love that question because it is a constant challenge. It is, and I do not in any way claim to have it completely figured out because we are constantly focused on how do we create equity? How do we make it fair? But there are, there's a large set of roles that do require, they must be completed in person. And so we understand that. And so then our approach is, what are the things that we can do to create similar dynamics? So maybe it's that we can't have, partially remote work, but could we have a 4-day work week? Is there a way to do that? And I'll tell you, like, spoiler alert, well, yes, there is. And like, we did that. Or is there a way to create more flexibility in the schedules? So, because the ultimate thing is employees want to feel like they have some say and that there is some flexibility in and when and which and how and the methods which they work. And so can we create those similar kind of dynamics and constructs within a different environment? And so that's the approach. It's not that we're never going to be able to peanut butter things across the board, but like, how do we create kind of more of a bespoke policy that hits at the same things that the employees want in both sides of the workforce?
And this is so inspiring. I think just trying to find commonalities and making such creative, decisions like the 4-day work week or in general, but also acknowledging that it cannot be equal. It cannot, but trying to find what it is. Lastly, Patty, question to you from Moira. How do you ensure employees are learning together from each other and sharing best ideas and growing their roles?
Yeah, it's a great question. The fact that we're all remote doesn't take away from the need for people to build relationships, to build connection, and to work together. A good example is our offsites are not always functionally aligned. My first offsite that I ever went to at GitLab was a finance one because they were working on a process that impacted the people team, and we wanted to do it together. So it's really intentional. We really build intentionality into our processes. A good example would be connection before content. So when managers have their one-on-one with their team member, they're asking, how are you doing? How are you feeling? How did your child do at their first day of school? We're building those connections on an ongoing basis, and it's part of our leadership expectation. So that's one way. The other way is we do have offsites to sit down with stakeholders that are embedded in a process. For instance, we want to redo a particular process that's quite large and has multiple stakeholders. We will bring everybody together, whether it's virtual or in person, and we'll bring everybody together and do whiteboarding sessions and really develop something together. With the pandemic, we experienced the same problem that everybody else did, is this lack of personal connection with each other. And we used to have a one-time, everybody goes to, it used to be called Contribute. It was a full company meetup, and it's for a week, and everybody gets together somewhere in the world. One time it was in South Africa, another time in New Orleans. And because of the pandemic, we haven't had that for 3 years. We are just now reinstituting that. And everybody is so excited to meet the people. I've not met some of my team members, and I've been here 2.5 years. So it's super, it has built this excitement that people actually get to see each other and actually have some fun together. So it's really important to build that, but we can't just rely on one time a year to do that. So we're building into our leadership, or we have built into our leadership training, we built into our expectations for all team members, coffee chats. I've had multiple coffee chats from people throughout the organization who just want to know me, or just want to know about people or policies, and they're just picking my brain, and it's quite nice to be able to open my time and my calendar up to people who are just interested, and vice versa. So it's intentional. It's not all the time organic. We have to be intentional about building those cross-functional efforts and making sure that we're all aligned. It's challenging to make sure that we're all marching to the same outcomes and the same goals, but it's important to bring people together to give their input. So we do it through a lot of intentionality. It's not something that we just hope people do. It's what we expect people to do.
Amazing. We'll pause here. Thank you, Patty, for joining me to another episode. I just see the amazing feedback from the audience. Thank you so much. I've learned so much. I hope the audience has, and we've learned from each other, which is quite phenomenal. So thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend, and see you next time in another episode of Coffee with Gable. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.